Today is October 19th, and I'm currently at home here in Seattle, Washington. But if you asked me where I was going to be on this day at the beginning of the year, I would have told you that I'm not supposed to be here. In fact, today I should have been on this flight, traveling to Baltimore, Maryland, then renting a car and driving about an hour north up to a small town called Darlington. My destination? A campground about 7 miles south of the border with Pennsylvania named Camp Ramblewood. And I wasn't planning on coming up here to go camping, at least not alone. I actually dislike camping quite a bit. But I was willing to put that aside for the actual reason why I was supposed to be here, a furry convention named Moon Howl Fest. It was a brand new con that planned to combine furries and camping, all while being run by people of color. But as you probably figured out by now, Moon Howl Fest never happened. But how could this be? How could a convention with this much hype, with such a unique theme and a bunch of money raised for it, die off before it even had its first event? Well, from problematic staff to getting scammed out of thousands of dollars, let's walk through the premature death of Moon Howl Fest. Alright, so before we get into the details of the demise of this con, let's take a closer look at what Moon Howl Fest was planned to be and why it garnered so much hype in the first place. Moon Howl Fest was a brand new furry convention that was designed to combine the themes of camping and the outdoors with the furry convention experience. It was a neat idea that was received pretty well by the general public when it was announced back in 2020, partly due to the notoriety of some of the staff, including Chisei, the furry that worked on the COVID vaccine, and also because the convention was being run by and put on for furries that were BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, people of color. And as someone who is a person of color myself, this particular convention also piqued my interest, and while I usually don't like going to the first edition of things, I was willing to give this a shot to help support a brand new, up-and-coming furry convention backed by people that looked more like me. Or at least I was interested in going before some of the news coming out of this proposed convention started to get a little weird. At first, some of the mishaps seemed like pretty harmless oversights. For example, the original name for this convention when it was first announced was actually Harvest Moon Fur Fest, but they changed it to Moon Howl Fest after Midwest Fur Fest, a con that has been around for a lot longer, requested them to change it to avoid any nasty legal action. A weird oversight that probably should have been considered when coming up with the name in the first place, but no biggie. I thought Howlfest was a more unique name anyway. Then there was the change of the date of the convention. Back when things were announced in 2020, the original dates for the first iteration of the con were October 20th through 24th in 2022. But as that date came closer, an announcement was made that they were going to wait one more year before starting and changed the date to this weekend at the time of posting this video, October 19th through the 23rd of 2023. Again, this really didn't concern me all that much, mainly because furry conventions here in the US were still in the process of transitioning back to normal after the pandemic at around that time, and I was cool with them waiting another year to make sure they had everything right instead of trying to rush something together at the last minute. So again, not the biggest red flag for me. But in between that first announcement in 2020 and the rescheduled date in 2023, some real bombshell revelations started coming out from the convention that really started to cripple its foundation. And strap in here, things get pretty wild pretty quickly. In 2020, one of the executive staff members was removed from their position for alleged sexually predatory behavior, which they subsequently mocked online. 2 years later, another executive staff member got into some controversy about raising funds for personal medical expenses, and after some investigation, some people alleged that those funds were spent on a fursuit. And while this wasn't directly related to the convention itself, it still eroded trust in the leadership of the new convention. Something that was directly related to the convention was the handling of merchandise, where a line of t-shirts was being sold to help support the startup of the convention. However, it was soon found out that the vendor that they were working with was allegedly engaging in fraudulent management of funds and only giving at most 10% of the sales towards the actual convention, which led to some of the staff filing an official complaint with the Attorney General of Ohio. And all of this, along from radio silence from official convention channels, culminated in one final announcement made earlier this year in June, where Moon Howl Fest officially ceased operations, canceling the convention that was supposed to happen this October. that was the last nail in the coffin. The convention was officially dead. All right, let's take a quick breath here. I don't know about you, but that was a lot. There seemed to be so many different things that went wrong, both directly and indirectly with this convention. So much so that if I had paid more attention to this a few months back, I probably would have seen all of this coming. But even with that being said, I'll be completely honest with you. I'm not really all that interested in looking more into the fall of this convention specifically. Sure, it would probably be pretty interesting to dive into more details about the alleged donation fraud or the alleged inappropriate behavior of the staff members, and I'll leave links in the description of where these allegations came from if you want to go down that journey yourself. But if I'm honest, that's starting to stray away from what this specific channel is about, where we like to look at why things in the furry fandom happen the way they do. With that in mind, with all of this information coming out, what I'm actually more interested in is why furry conventions die in the first place. Because as dramatic as the story of this specific con dying may be, what happened to Harvest Moon Howl Fest isn't a unique phenomenon. Conventions, specifically furry conventions, close down all the time, which might seem a little bit weird for a fandom that is so supportive of each other and so keen on keeping that support within the fandom itself. So why is starting and running a furry convention such a volatile business to be in? Well, if we look at this through the lens of the death of Harvest Moon Howl Fest, the answers start to become quite clear. Now, there are a lot of factors that go into running something as complicated as a furry convention, but none of the details can be taken care of without having two very important things: a strong leadership team and enough money that is properly managed. And when it comes to why some furry conventions, including Harvest Moon Howl Fest, die out, it's mainly because they were lacking in one of those two areas, or in many cases, lacking in both. Let's start by looking at the strong leadership aspect of things, because the way I see it, this is where a majority of Harvest Moon Howl Fest's problems stemmed from. When running something like a furry convention, which is an event for the general public, there are two very important attributes that a leadership team should possess: good teamwork and good communication. Now, I hope that having a team with strong teamwork skills is rather obvious. Starting and running a convention is not an easy feat by any means, and the staff behind a convention are typically constructed to leverage each individual member's strengths and expertise in a certain knowledge area to help solve any problems that come up throughout the convention production process. And when members of those teams either leave on their own or are forcibly removed for whatever reason, the team now has a knowledge gap that has to be filled by either finding other team members or by the remaining team members themselves. Either one of those options increases the stress level of everyone else on the team, which could lower morale and eventually cause a snowball effect that causes other team members to leave as well. Secondly, team members should also have good communication skills, both for communicating within the team, but also out to the general public who are eagerly waiting for more information about what is going on with your convention. I think part of what made Harvest Moon Howl Fest's demise so ugly was because of the lack of communication from official channels. This is something that I can personally attest to. Back in October of 2022, I actually applied to be a staff member of Harvest Moon Howl Fest. At that time, I was just curious if there was any direct way for me to support this up-and-coming convention, and was excited to go through the process to see what my options were, even if I wasn't accepted for the role at all. So I filled out the application, waited for a response, and got nothing. Other than a copy of my responses to the Google form, I got no communication from anyone on the Harvest Moon Howl Fest existing staff about the status of my application. Kind of like applying for a real job today. Now, could I have been more proactive and followed up with them on the status of my application? Sure, but in retrospect, I'm not even sure if I would have gotten a response in the first place, based on some other points of contact also being shuttered, like the website suddenly going dark and the lack of updates in the Telegram channel at around that same time. Even in their closing statement, there was some language in there that implied some struggles with support from the local community when they were trying to get the con up and running. Now, the details on that are a bit fuzzy, so I'm not going to focus too much on them, but at the very least, it sounds like there was a lack of communication from the team to the overall community. And then there's the second half of this, the money side of things. And while having a strong leadership team is essential to running any furry convention, even that doesn't really matter if you don't have the money to run a con in the first place. Now again, while I still would argue that most of Harvest Moon Howl Fest's issues stemmed from the fallout of the staff, some issues with money, and specifically money management, surely didn't help their cause either. This included the most glaring problem of this type, their issues with the t-shirt vendor selling merch on their behalf. It's not a good look financially when you're being scammed out of thousands of dollars that were meant to help start the convention itself. Now, to be fair, you could make the argument that getting scammed like that is out of the convention's direct control, but I would counter that something like this happening could have been avoided altogether with a more thorough job of vetting that vendor of choice, or having more eyes on the transaction between the two parties that might have helped catch the fraud early on. And then there's this whole thing about donations that were being accepted while the con was still in development, and while this one is a bit harder to criticize since at the end of the day they were voluntary donations that had no guarantee of being refunded, it still would have been helpful to know more about where those donations were being used, being a bit more specific than just startup costs. But the main point here is that issues with staff and finances have plagued furry conventions for decades at this point. Harvest Moon Howl Fest was just another victim. For example, the changing of ownership or a refresh in staff sometimes proves to be too disruptive to continue a convention, such as with Fur Idaho, which shuttered after changing staff in 2013. And there are numerous conventions that have been canceled due to a lack of enough funds to run for another year, and a whole host of cons that have been canceled due to mismanagement of the funds that they did have. In fact, if you look at the history of canceled conventions, you start to see a pattern with conventions like Further North, whose finances were run through a PayPal account that was randomly frozen one day, rendering them unable to pay their suppliers and leading to that convention being canceled in 2013. Or Rocky Mountain FurCon, which, amongst a whole host of other problems, allegedly underpaid their taxes, leading to their demise in 2017. When you put these examples into context, the financial issues that Harvest Moon Howl Fest ran into seem rather tame in comparison. And it's not like those are the only reasons why conventions get canceled either. We could do a whole video about how congoers themselves cause conventions to be canceled, with Rainforest 2015 and even the 8th iteration of the very first convention, Conference, being primary examples. All of this is to say that while Harvest Moon Howl Fest's death was particularly ugly, a furry convention being canceled in such fashion isn't all that out of the ordinary. Furry conventions are hard to run, and without a strong staff that has good teamwork and communication skills and money that is managed properly, it's extremely difficult to get an organized gathering of furry enthusiasts up and running. Now, that's definitely not to say that these challenges are insurmountable. You can look at examples like Las Vegas FurCon, a convention that started with the same focus of BIPOC leadership, and how they have gotten off to a flying start. Or you could take a look at a convention like Eurofriends, whose leadership team solved the very difficult problem of having to suddenly change venues by moving the convention across the country and putting on a fantastic event in a brand new space. But I do believe that a lot of the hate that Harvest Moon Howl Fest got after it announced its cancellation was a bit unwarranted, just based on how difficult the task of starting and running a convention is. At the same time though, they are not completely absolved of criticism, and the fact that they didn't rectify problematic staff members promptly, didn't properly vet merchandise partners to avoid being scammed out of thousands of dollars, all while lacking clear and transparent communication throughout the process, all stand as examples of how not to execute the startup of a new furry convention. It really puts into perspective the conventions that furries do have and the ones that have been around for a long time, and is a stark reminder for me personally to truly enjoy and appreciate the ones that I can attend. Because there's always a chance that some furry conventions might die out in the future, or in some cases, might end up dead on arrival. Alright.